It's the gold. It's cursed.
The journey was proven to be much more troublesome than the Texosages expected. First, they lost their chieftain Brennus, even before they left Greece. Then, half of their food supplies went moldy and had to be thrown out. The weather took a turn for the worse after they reached the Alps. Torrential rains turned the roads to mud, slowing their march to a crawl. But worst of all was the disease. As the tribe left the mountain passes behind them, a pestilent distemper began its rampage through the Tectosages camp, claiming the young and the old alike. Such misfortune could not have been random chance. The gods were clearly displeased with the Tectosages, and some of the tribesmen were already sure of the reason why.
It's the gold.
Will you ever shut up, old man? If you're so afraid of the gold, I can throw away your share. Or better yet, I'll take it for myself and release you from this curse you keep babbling about.
No, it won't work. It's like the blind woman said. The curse is on all of us for stealing what belonged to the gods. They are punishing us.
The gold in question was the spoils from the great temple that they sacked. Chieftain Brennus promised great plunder when he called for the Gallic tribes to unite for an invasion of Greece. It went well in the beginning. The chieftain outfoxed the Greeks at Thermopylae and marched his army to Delphi, where they looted the treasures of the temple of Apollo. The promise of great plunder was fulfilled. But it all went downhill from there. The Gauls were driven off from Delphi, and Brennus died of wounds shortly after. Their great host had split. Some took the offer of the Bithynian king and went with him across the Hellespont. Others returned to Pannonia with what loot they could carry. The Tectosages went further still. There wasn't enough good land in Pannonia for them, so they continued west to the more fertile valleys of southern Gaul, and they carried their share of the spoils with them. But the journey was plagued by so many ill fortunes that the rumor started that they had angered the gods. Stealing the temple treasure was a great sacrilege, one that could bring damnation on the whole tribe. Some even started agitating their clansmen to abandon the riches, for a chance to be rid of the curse. Amborix was the Tectosages chieftain, and parting with his hard-fought spoils of the invasion was the last thing that he wanted.
You want us to haul it back to Greece, is that it?
The old man went silent for a moment, thinking.
The lake. Throw it in the lake. The gods will have their due. The lake, he says. Now you better shut your mouth, or I will throw you in the lake.
This put an end to the old man's superstitious grumbling for a time. But as days went by without a respite from the plague, more voices were added to his calls. Soon the whole tribe was on the verge of mutiny. They didn't want to suffer for one man's greed anymore, and were ready to jump his throat. Seeing what was coming for him, Amborix decided to act first. Saying that the treasure of the gods belongs in the house of the gods, he volunteered to deposit the gold in the shrine of a local settlement. Some were skeptical of his suggestion, suspecting that he was up to something, but enough people were convinced that the plan was sound, so the tribe continued forth. The few tribesmen who still wanted to keep the treasure were silenced when the plague subsided as soon as they moved on. A couple of men remained in the settlement to guard the shrine, but the treasure's ill fame was enough to ward off any thief. One man, however, was yet undeterred. After the Tectosages reached their destination and settled into their new homes, Amborix decided to pay a visit to the shrine. He set off in the middle of the night to avoid unwanted questions. As he rode along a moonlit forest road, a shadow among the trees spooked his horse. The beast lost her footing and threw her rider from the saddle. Amborix fell headfirst onto the ground, and just like that, the chieftain of the Tectosages was no more. No one else would dare think about touching the gold for some 150 years. That is, until the Romans came. In the late 2nd century BC, the Romans sought to connect their Italian homeland with their Spanish possessions, which meant conquering southern Gaul. But the Gauls resisted fiercely and defeated Roman armies more than once. This nut had proven so tough to crack that in 106 BC, the Senate dispatched a full consular army under the command of one Quintus Servilius Caepio. The Servilii Caepiones were an ancient noble family, boasting many consuls among their ranks. They even traced their lineage to a hero of the old republic, Gaius Servilius Ahala. Ahala was famous for saving Rome from Spurius Maelius, a wealthy and popular man who planned on making himself king. Servilius Ahala ended his royal ambitions with the dagger concealed under his robes. To live up to their ancestors' name, the Servilii Caepiones were expected to be the paragons of republican virtue, but around the middle of the 2nd century BC, one particular apple fell very far from the tree. The decline of the Roman Republic was a long and complex process, but if its reasons had to be summarized in 3 words, those words would have been corruption, arrogance, and greed. Incidentally, the same 3 words would make a perfect epigraph for the story of Quintus Servilius Caepio, the consul for 106 BC. Late Republican Rome had quite a power imbalance between the elite senatorial class and the rest of the population. The senators called all the shots, while the poor and the upper middle class equestrians had to contend with what few privileges they had. One of the few checks on the senatorial dominance was the exclusive right for the equestrians to sit on the jury. It was especially important for corruption trials. It was no secret that many Roman politicians viewed appointments for the provincial government as opportunities to enrich themselves. The saying was that a governor needed 3 years in control of a province, one to recuperate the money he spent to get elected, the second one to fill his own pockets, and another one for all the bribes he'd have to pay to avoid prosecution. But the governors were at least expected to keep their greed in check and shear their flock instead of skinning them, so to speak. Some less scrupulous politicians, however, went beyond expected decency and bled their population dry. In such cases, the locals could bring their grievances to the Senate. A special corruption court was established where these types of trials were held, and the jury consisted solely of men of equestrian rank. It's not like the equestrians were all incorruptible paragons of virtue, but at least they were less likely to side with the corrupt governor than his senatorial bodies. So naturally, Servilius Caepio started his consulship with a bill that stripped this privilege from the equestrians. At least half of the jurors would now be chosen from among the senatorial class, who would be more amenable if one of them found himself on the wrong side of the law. Stacking the deck in your favor like this would be especially prudent if you were planning to flagrantly break the law sometime soon. And when it came to enriching himself, Caepio was as prudent as they get. Having secured himself a more favorable trial in the future, Caepio set out to pacify the Gauls and secure Garonne Valley for Rome. Command of the legions always came with the possibility of the spoils of war, but not even Caepio himself expected it to yield dividends this fast. When he took the town of Tolosa from the Tectosages, he discovered a huge stash of gold in the local temple. 50,000 bars of gold and 10,000 bars of silver. Accounts differ on what this actually amounted to, but every number put forward is quite staggering. According to Orosius, it was 10,000 pounds of gold and 110,000 pounds of silver. Strabo's estimate is even higher. Citing Poseidonius, he claims that the treasure amounted to some 15,000 talents, or 90 million denarii. To put this number into perspective, the annual state revenue of the Republic was around 40 to 45 million. Caepio held in his hands twice the amount of money that the Roman treasury was getting in a year. Of course, he couldn't take all this gold for himself. Looting a temple would be considered sacrilege. But what Caepio could do was give a great gift to the beloved Republic. No one can deny a patriotic Roman consul his right to enrich the fatherland. So Caepio took the treasure from the temple and sent it to the port of Massilia, from where it could be transported to Rome by sea. But on its way to Massilia, the convoy was beset by a group of bandits, and all the gold was stolen. Oh, what an unfortunate freak accident that no one could have predicted or prevented. Well, what can you do? The gods giveth, and the gods taketh away. If Caepio only knew that there were so many bandits in the area, Yeah, no one believed in his story. Everyone suspected that these random bandits were actually hired by Caepio, so he could take the gold for himself. However, no one could really do anything about it right now. Not while Caepio was a consul in charge of a big army. The next year, Caepio's consular term ran out, and he was appointed a proconsul for Gaul. As you may remember, sacking temples and losing copious sums of gold was not why he was sent to the province in the first place. There was a Gallic revolt that needed to be put down. The goals were more or less specified by then, but another problem still remained. In recent years, the Romans had encountered a wandering Germanic tribe called the Cimbri, and these Cimbri were making them increasingly uneasy. They had already inflicted 2 defeats on the legions in 113 and 109. This demonstration of Roman weakness was what spurred the Gauls to revolt in the first place. However, the Cimbri themselves were not keen on invading Italy. The Romans were the ones provoking them to battle and repeatedly taking a beating. The Cimbri were looking for a new homeland for themselves, not for a fight. Still, the Republic could not tolerate a hostile tribe roaming along its borders, especially one capable of beating its armies. When the Cimbri returned to southern Gaul in 105, the job of securing the Roman frontier fell to Caepio and the year's consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus. The combined force of 2 Roman generals was massive. Caepio had his proconsular legions and several thousand allies, while Mallius came with a full consular army. Together, just the regulars amounted to 80,000, with about half of that in auxiliaries. This might have been the biggest army the Republic had ever assembled. But all this strength was united only on paper. In reality, this was not one Roman army, but 2. By order of rank, Mallius was the senior officer. No one could outrank a consul. But Mallius was an inexperienced general, and worse yet, he was a novus homo, a new man. Being a novus homo meant that you were the first of your family to receive a political office, in this case a consulship. Now, from our perspective, this may sound like a positive. Indeed, modern politicians never shut up about how they grew up middle class, or how their great-grandfather was a coal miner. In Republican Rome, however, having a modest pedigree was a disadvantage. Sure, it might still mean some kind of solidarity from the lower classes, but politically it was worth much less than connections with rich and influential senators. Many of the senatorial elite looked down upon the new man, and no one embodied this attitude as much as Quintus Servilius Caepio. In October 105, the commanders learned that the Cimbri would soon arrive in Roman Gaul. But Caepio, too proud and arrogant to do the bidding of a novus homo, outright refused to follow Mallius's orders and join the armies together. When Mallius camped his army on the bank of the Rhone River, Caepio, to spite him, put his army on the opposite side, and would not move even when a delegation from the Senate begged him to do so. He told them that this side of the Rhone was his proconsular province, and he had full freedom of action in his own domain. Only when the Roman scouts spotted a Cimbri vanguard did Caepio heed Mallius's call to cross to his side. He mockingly remarked that he'd be happy to do so, to calm down cowardly frightened Mallius. However, he still had no intention of actually joining forces with the consul. Doing so would mean helping a novus homo win glory and riches, and Caepio wanted all that for himself. Instead, he camped between Mallius and the approaching Cimbri, so that the tribe's ambassadors would have to go to him first. When they came to negotiate for land to settle, Caepio sent them back with nothing but insults and mockery. One of 2 things happened next. Either Caepio then hastily tried to start a battle, or the insulted Cimbri launched a quick attack that caught his army off guard. Either way, in a few hours' time, Caepio found his legions routed and his camp being ransacked. The army that the Romans faced was not just the Cimbri. They were a coalition of several tribes that numbered around 200,000. United and in a proper battlefield order, the better-trained Roman army would have still had a tough fight on its hands, but disjointed and disorganized, they stood no chance at all. Caepio's soldiers quickly turned to flight and ran into Malleus' army, so in panic and confusion. The Cimbri and their allies quickly dealt with the remains of Caepio's army and fell on the demoralized and already wavering soldiers of Malleus. Surrounded on three sides and with their backs against the river, the legionnaires faced slaughter. At the end of the day, around 100,000 Roman soldiers lay dead. Almost no one made it out alive. Well, except for the guy who deserved it the least. Seeing the consequences of his actions unfolding, Quintus Servilius Caepio decided not to face them, turned tail and ran. Both he and Malleus made it safely to Rome. But although Caepio made it out alive, the same couldn't have been said about his career. The popular assembly stripped him of his proconsular imperium and expelled him from the Senate. But for the time being, his earlier political moves saved him from any further indignation. Remember that law that required senators to be on the jury for the corruption trials? When the charges of embezzlement were brought up against Caepio, the jury was packed with enough of his senatorial bodies that he managed to get off scot-free. The punishment only came 2 years later. A pair of radical populist tribunes brought Caepio to trial for losing his army. Some friends of Caepio tried to hinder the proceedings, but the prosecutors started a riot to chase them out of the assembly. Caepio was convicted, fined an astronomical sum of money, and sentenced to permanent exile. But where did the gold go? There's no way to tell for sure. The people of Rome suspected that Caepio left most of the gold to his family, because despite their patriarch's exile, the Servilii Caepiones managed to stay very rich. As time went by, however, these riches garnered less and less envy. Woes and misery were haunting the members of the Caepiones clan, as if they were cursed. The elder Caepio now lived in exile in Anatolia, but his son remained in Rome. Quintus Servilius the Younger followed in his father's footsteps by championing senatorial dominance of the Republic, and combating every attempt of the lower classes to shift the balance. In 91 BC, as praetor, Caepio vehemently opposed the grant of Roman citizenship to her Italian allies, proposed by Marcus Livius Drusus. Drusus and Caepio were former friends and brothers-in-law, as each was married to another's sister, but the pair fell out over the sale of a golden ring at an auction. We don't know the details of the breakup, but apparently it was so toxic that the two became bitter rivals and even divorced their wives as to not be associated with each other anymore. Their political leanings did nothing to mend the rift. Caepio was the champion of the aristocracy, while Drusus took up popular causes. One such cause, that of the Italian allies, would prove to be the undoing for both him and his former friend. People from many different communities of Italy had served in Roman armies for centuries and were an integral part of the Republic's military. Yet they had absolutely no say in its politics, and their legal status was barely above that of Rome's conquered subjects. Angered by decades of Roman ingratitude, the Italians were clamoring for citizenship and voting rights. Drusus made this issue part of his sweeping reform program, but he faced a powerful opposition. The ranks of the bill's opponents included many influential senators, and even the standing consul. The proposed reform became a source of political turmoil, with plots and intrigues abound and violence in the streets. The tensions came to a boiling point when late in the year, Drusus was mysteriously murdered at his own house. The culprit was never found, but the main suspects were the opponents of his citizenship bill, first and foremost Quintus Servilius Caepio. After all, assassinating overly ambitious populists was a familial duty for the descendants of Servilius Ahala. Drusus's legislation, had it passed, would have made him a hero for the numerous Italians. This kind of popular support always made the Roman elite uneasy. Alas, with Drusus dead, the Italians despaired of getting justice at the Roman Forum and decided to take it by force. 12 Italian tribes banded together into a Confederation of Italia as an alternative to being ruled by the Romans. Chief among the rebellious tribes were the Marsi people. The ensuing conflict, which is now called the Social War, was called the Marsic War by its Roman contemporaries. A Marsic aristocrat, Quintus Perpetuus Silo, was elected one of the first 2 consuls of Italia. Early on in the war, Servilius Caepio was dispatched to put down the Marsic uprising and won a quick victory. As he was contemplating future war plans in his camp, he received the news that the general of the Marsi was outside requesting an audience with him. This general was none other than one of the revolt's leaders, Quintus Popedius Silo. He told Caepio that he realized it was all a mistake, that he was a fool to try and challenge the might of Rome, and that he wanted to defect to the Romans. He pointed out that with his defection, his own army was now leaderless, and if Caepio hurried, he could just capture the entire force without a fight. As a token of his faith, he brought his 2 infant sons as hostages. Utterly convinced by this tribute, Caepio the Younger followed Silo to the Marsi camp, expecting a quick and bloodless triumph. But this was not meant to be. When they approached the spot of the supposed camp, Silo ran up a nearby hill, as though to look for his man. But as soon as he was outside of a pilum throwing range, scores of Marsi warriors sprang up from the forest all around Caepio's party. This was an ambush. The whole defection was a ruse, and Silo's supposed sons were merely slave babies dressed up in purple-bordered garments of noble children. The ones disorganized and leaderless were not the Marsi but the Romans, whose lightly defended camp was now being overrun, as the rest of their army faced a massacre in the forest. Their general was among the first to fall. Appian reports that Silo had personally slain Caepio as revenge for the murder of his friend Drusus. Grief-stricken by the news of his son's death, Caepio the Elder soon died still in exile. The Caepiones family line was continued by his 2 grandchildren, a grandson of the same name, and his half-sister Servilia. Servilia married a man from an ancient Junii family. Junii's legendary ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, was famous for standing up to the last Roman king Tarquin the Proud and expelling the tyrant from the city. A child born from the union of Servili and Junii Brutii would be destined by fate to oppose anyone who dares call himself king of Rome. Unfortunately, Servilia's husband chose the wrong side in one of Rome's many civil wars of that century. On the siege at the city of Mutina, his army abandoned him, and he had to flee, before being captured and executed without a trial on the orders of Pompey Magnus. As a rebel, he was proscribed by the Senate. His only son with Servilia had to be adopted by his uncle, Quintus Caepio, so as not to be banned from Roman politics as a relative of an enemy of the state. The man whom history remembers as Marcus Junius Brutus used Quintus Servilius Caepio Brutus as his legal name. The story of this most famous of Caepio's descendants has been retold many times. The pressure on the man to live up to the name of his ancestor on the father's side is often emphasized, but his matrilineal forebear's shadow loomed just as large. Even before Caesar took over Roman politics, Brutus had minted coins with both his famous ancestors to make his admiration for the tyrannicides known. Back then, he probably believed Pompey to be the tyrant he'd have to confront, the man responsible for an unlawful execution of his father. In the end, Marcus Brutus' story turned out closer to that of Ahala. With a dagger concealed in his senatorial toga, Brutus struck down a man who dreamt of making himself king of Rome. But this deed did not bring him the admiration of the people, nor did it restore the Republic to what it used to be. Brutus had to flee the city he wanted to save from tyranny, and in 2 years, Caesar's successors came to him to claim their revenge. Defeated and cornered by Octavian and Antony, Brutus dismissed his remaining soldiers and fell on his own sword. Thus died the last man rumored to have touched the gold of Tolosa. He left no children, and the name of Serviliae Caepiones had died with him. So, was the gold truly cursed? Did Caepio bring damnation upon his family by embezzling what belonged to the gods? For a definitive answer, we probably have to ask Apollo himself, since the ancient historians can't agree on any single version. Strabo, for one, claims that back in the 270s, there probably wasn't even any gold for the Gauls to loot, because Delphi had already been despoiled by the Phocians in the Third Sacred War. Others are less skeptical of the existence of the gold. After all, there had been 80 years between the Phocian and the Gallic sack. But they are still reluctant to connect Caepio's gold with the spoils of Brennus's campaign. Posidonius believed that the gold was of local origin, since the country was rich in gold, and also belonged to the people who were God-fearing and not extravagant in their ways of living. And of course none of them was superstitious enough to blame the curse for the misfortunes of Caepio and his descendants. Nevertheless, for the people of Rome the connection was clear as day. Greek or Gallic may it be, no man should have taken for himself what belonged to the gods. And by doing so, Servilius Caepio brought a terrible curse upon his family. But was it really the curse, or did those men just live in a time when violence reigned supreme over the Roman Republic? Servili Caepiones were not the only family to be extinguished in the civil wars of the 1st century BC. Nor do we actually know enough about Brutus's uncle and adoptive father to say that every descendant of the corrupt proconsul was cursed to end his life in misery. The youngest Quintus Caepio was inconspicuous enough to not have made any powerful enemies, which is both a rare occurrence in late Roman Republic, and the best protective charm against any curse. Or maybe he just didn't touch any of that gold from Delphi. I guess we'll never know. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions left on the topic, feel free to ask them in the comments. I'd like to give special thanks to my Patreon supporters: Mulai Cherkawi, Conventus Orbis, Pikimis, Mikius Porcius, Simon Baumgartner, and others. And for the rest of you, thanks a lot for watching to the end, and I will see you in the next one.